According to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, there were 653,104 homeless people in the United States in 2023, which is a 12% increase from the year before. But this number only includes people who were accounted for, and the homeless women and men who stay in the shadows, living in hotel rooms, cars, and floating from couch to couch in an effort to stay off the street aren't included in these numbers. Join us today as we take a look at hidden homelessness in the United States through the 1992 documentary It Was a Wonderful Life. You're listening to Real Stories, Real Problems with Rachel and Roxanne.
Hey, Rachel, how are you today?
I'm good. How are you, Roxanne?
I am foaming at the mouth over this one. I am equally furious and depressed and afraid.
I knew you
Oh,
were going to have some opinions on this one.
yes. I am. I do. Just a little a background for our listeners. I have been homeless now for about 8 months. Um, I am currently living in a hotel, like you said in your intro. Um, I it was a series of just circumstantial things. I lost my job. And because I lost my job, I had to cash in my life insurance policy, and that's what's funding my living in the motel. But that's going to run out eventually, and I don't have a car, and it's one thing just feeds into another. And just like in the documentary, if you saw me on the street, you would absolutely not know that I am homeless. You certainly you would not know. I do have a part-time retail job, which I love, but I'm just not getting enough hours there where I'm able to survive. And because I don't have a car, I have to Uber to and from this job, which eats up 2 hours worth of salary. So it's like I'm chasing my tail, and watching that documentary, it just hits so close to home. And so I can't wait to get into this with you, and I'm so thrilled that you recommended this one for our podcast. So
Yeah,
let's get into
absolutely.
it.
So this documentary is called It Was a Wonderful Life. It was filmed in 1992 and it was directed by Michelle O'Hayon. Is how I'm thinking we pronounce her name. I'm
Yes,
not
yes.
100% certain. But at this time in 1992, when this documentary was being filmed, this was the year that Silence of the Lambs won 5 Academy Awards, first horror movie ever to win an Academy Award. Th-
Yes.
This was the year John Gotti got convicted of the murder of mob boss Paul Castellano and racketeering and was later sentenced to a life in prison. This was the year a jury acquitted the LAPD officers accused of excessive force in the beating of Rodney King and caused the
Oh,
1992 LA riots. Um,
oh.
yeah, this was the year that the 27th Amendment became law, barring the U.S. Congress from giving itself a midterm or retroactive pay raise. This was the year Johnny Carson retired, and this was the year that Depo-Provera was first approved by the FDA as a contraceptive in the United States. And the thing that everybody will remember this year for, billionaire Ross Perot announced he was going to run for U.S. president, and thanks to his third-party announcement, a lot of people give him credit for Bill Clinton being elected. But that was the year that Bill Clinton was elected president, and all of that nonsense began in 1992.
And 1992, I mean, of course, I remember everything that you just said, but in 1992, I was deeply entrenched in graduate school, where I was pursuing the first of my two PhDs. And, at that point, I thought I was going to be set for life. I was young and strong and brilliant and educated, and I had my professorships all lined up and everything. And if you had come to me, at that time and said, guess what? In 30 years, you're going to be living in a hotel with, only about two relatives left in your family that'll still speak to you, I would have just patted you on the head and said, no, that's never going to happen to me. Not to me, who grew up with white privilege and, a nice middle class home, parents that were together, or, and there was no divorce, there was no poverty, there was certainly no abuse. I had a relationship, I had friends, and how quickly, those things can go.
Well, you and I had very different 1992s because I think I was in second grade, third grade at that point. So,
Great.
so would have been a very different experience.
Different kind of thing. Yeah.
One of the things that I found that it was a little bit weird to me, and I didn't know if I wanted to mention it or not, it was 1992 was so much torture and murder. Like there was a group of 11-year-old girls who murdered one of their classmates in a really horrific fashion, and that was a big news thing. And there were
Mhm.
multiple situations where people were like targeted and murdered by like serial killers and stuff. It was nuts. As I was going.
Oh, it was like the Wild West. Absolutely.
And so
Yeah.
I, being in second or third grade at the time, I was aware of none of that. I was
Hmm.
just coming out of baby Jessica fell down a well, and that was a concern for me because I was also a kid. Like that,
Right, exactly. And you could fall down a well at any moment. Yes.
right? That was my concern at that time. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, so 1992 was a heck of a year.
Hmm.
And I think for the women in this documentary, more so than anybody.
Yeah.
Um, because this documentary, narrated by Jodie Foster,
Hmm.
follows the lives of like five, six, seven women who were at one point very prosperous and
Hmm.
had solid middle class lives and were doing okay. And over the course of a few weeks, suddenly became homeless.
Right, right. And it does happen that quickly. It really, really does. Just one unfortunate mistake, not mistake even, one unfortunate circumstance, and that's it. And it's harder to climb out of than it is to, fall into, unfortunately.
Yeah, there was one of the women in the documentary, and I pulled this out as the only quote that I was like, we have to talk about this. Rena, one of the women that they talked to, says, "You see a lot about helping the homeless. Why can't the help come before you're homeless?" And I think that
Exactly.
that is, it feels like to me, the central premise of this documentary. Because
Hmm.
when we talk to, like, the very first woman that we see is Louise Hall. She's 37 years old. She's a waitress. She has been separated from her husband and homeless for a year. And she talks about her parents kicked her out of the house at 18, but she got married and she and her husband were okay. But then her husband lost his job and he couldn't pay his half of the bills. And that spiraled out into it went from her having an apartment with her husband and being okay to now they're divorced and now she lives in a U-Haul when she
Well,
has the
oh,
money.
yes, yes, exactly.
And so going from a situation that every married person I think has handled at some point or another, where one of you loses your job and the other one's kind of paying the bills, and you're trying to balance back and forth with how are we taking care of all of this, her situation just evolved. And she,
Hmm.
over the course of a few weeks, maybe a couple months, had nothing. And
Right.
so was forced to be homeless. And we saw with Rena, who was a former professional musician. She toured Europe. She married one of
Hmm.
the musicians in the band, and they had a wonderful life. He asked her to stop working, start a family. When she was pregnant with their sixth child, he left
Hmm.
and never paid a dime in child support. She couldn't even find him.
Right. She didn't even know
And
where he was. Hmm.
so, yeah, this is the story of all of these women. But even like we saw Josephine, who I think was the one who I thought the most of you when I saw her story. She was a professor with a doctorate.
Yes.
She was fine. She made a bad investment financially. She
Hmm.
didn't say what it was, but my guess it was that she probably bought a big stock that tanked or invested in something that ended up being shady on the other end, and she
Or it
lost
could have been
everything.
one of the dot com, things that were around back then. So yeah.
Yeah, or like she could have got caught up in a Ponzi scheme or some kind of
Oh,
non
sure,
like
sure.
But something in that vein was kind of what I was getting from her explanation. But now she lives in her car. It took 2 weeks
Yeah.
from, oh my God, this investment has gone south, to I can't pay my bills. I'm now I have no place to live. I'm now living in my car.
Hmm.
And she doesn't think of herself as homeless. She like house sits,
Right.
temporary places to live and all of that. But she very clearly like was sleeping in like a tiny Mazda hatchback or something, like a very small vehicle. Because she,
Right. Yes. Yeah. And she said, my body doesn't even stretch out all the way in the back of this car because of course she had all everything she owns in the car with her, I mean, we do still have possessions and we do still have to have like one or two very nice outfits for interviews or and but in the meantime we're washing our hair in gas station bathrooms, drying our hair on the hand dryers and just it's learning to be very, I don't want to say street smart, but just learning little tricks, about how to get by for one more day without devolving into absolute chaos. It's remarkable.
yep. And then there was Marie, the woman who lived in her car with her two dogs, who worked
Oh,
multiple jobs and due to losing one, found that she didn't have the means to cover her bills and ended up homeless. And
mhm,
she had been a real estate agent and she didn't even have a bank account anymore. And
right.
she was the one who, because her life was built around and in her car, she was accumulating parking tickets. And eventually the city of Santa Monica told her, look, we won't arrest you if you just leave. Like you have whatever 36 hours or whatever time limit they gave her and said, get out of Santa Monica. And so
Right.
she decided she was going to go to Oregon. And then the
Hmm.
documentary people never heard from her again. So I have no
Hmm.
idea what happened to her.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's I don't know. And how many times are we driving around? And I mean, I know I've seen this many times in parking lots. I've seen cars that are packed up to the rafters with what I always wrote off as junk or it's a hoarder or something. But no, it's probably not a hoarder. It's probably somebody in that exact situation. When I was living in my car when I first became homeless. This is when I obviously still had a car, and that's exactly what that car looked like. I had my clothes, I had all my paperwork, I had documents, and there's not a lot of places, at least in my state, where you can park overnight and be safe. First of all, as a woman, that is something that you always have to keep in mind, unfortunately, and when you're asleep, you're really, really vulnerable, you know. So it was the Walmart parking lot for me. That's where I was overnight. But there's issues like the bathroom and things that you just don't think about. All of a sudden it's 4 o'clock in the morning and you really need to use a bathroom and there is no bathroom. The Walmart itself isn't open anymore. It's just the parking lot. Yeah, so many things you don't think about.
Yeah, and it is so strange to think about because I realized a couple of years ago that this was happening with people in my community, but that I had that click from, wow, that's a messy car, to that is a homeless person living in that car. And
Hmm.
even though I live in a relatively well-to-do area,
Hmm.
there are at least 7 or 8 homeless people that I can identify on site because I know them by their car or by
Right.
I see them around town. We have one guy who literally every day has a cart that he pushes probably 4 or 5 miles back and up and
Oh.
down this highway, and
Hmm.
everybody knows him. And if he doesn't have his cart, everybody in town basically understands that he's safe. You can pick him up and give him a ride where he's going if he doesn't have all of his things. But even in a really pretty wealthy area, we have homeless people living kind of in and
Yes.
among everybody here. This is not just a New York City and Los Angeles problem. This is literally
Sure, sure.
everywhere.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's just because you don't see the person standing on the street corner with the cardboard sign and the ratty Starbucks cup, asking for change. I mean, when I was growing up, I was always told, oh, they're mentally ill or they're drug addicts or they're alcoholics. And, and I was trained to believe that it was all their fault. No, no, not in many cases, it's not. And especially with the women in the documentary, I mean, how many of them were fleeing abusive partners,
Or were
that
abandoned by
was,
partners who
or who were
didn't take.
abandoned by the men in their life.
Yeah, there was one woman who had gotten knocked up by her boss, and she
Right,
had sued him, and she lost the paternity suit because this was
right.
1992. This was before DNA was
Sure, sure.
a thing. And so she and her son lived in a van while she was studying to she was going to law school.
Law school,
So
right.
somehow I don't anticipate that the people at the law school had any idea that she was living in a van with her son at
Hmm.
that point. And her son was like 10 or 11 years old, so they had been living this way for probably his entire life if she had had to
Right,
go through the paternity suit with her boss to try to get the bills paid.
right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And the also the theory, I mean, like you brought up the law school thing. People say, well, why don't they just go out and get a job, or why don't they just do X, Y, and Z? It costs money to do X, Y, and Z. My ex-husband is an attorney, and we were married when he was going in through law school, and it wasn't even just the tuition, it's the books, it's the travel, it's you have to pay to go to the workshops that they make you go to. Tuition is just the beginning of all of those, all of those expenses. And a lot of the times, even if you do get a job, it's an entry level job, you don't have health insurance for the first 6 months or the first year. And I mean my health is at an all-time low because I can't afford any medical care. Um, it's oh, it's my heart just broke watching all of these women trying to maintain dignity too, you know.
Yes, and it was difficult to watch, especially within a lens of our modern world, because I don't know what
Mhm.
happened to these women after this documentary. Like, I went and tried to see if I could track down because they gave us first and last names for a few of them,
Sure.
and I couldn't find anything on anybody. So where
Hmm.
these women went, I don't know. But like today, I know I lost my job in October. I have applied for, at this point, almost 200 jobs.
Sure.
I got a call back from one person and they took my information and have entered me into a pool of freelancers. And if a job pops up in that, I could earn a couple $100s at a time, one article at a time, hoping
Mhm.
that I can build that out into something, which is possible. I've had a freelance career in the past. I can certainly do
Mhm.
that again, but that takes so much time. It takes years, and you have to have money to pay your bills while you're building up into that.
Exactly. And it's
And
so sporadic. It's like so you get your check for $200, whatever. You're like, okay, that's groceries for the week. And then what? What about next week and the week after that?
yeah.
You know?
And so watching like people looking at women like this and saying, "Well, why don't you just get another job? Why don't you just get a second job?" Well, today that's almost impossible. Like I don't know that you could get it would take you 4 to 6 months to even try to find a job in today's market.
Mhm.
In 1992, I imagine it was maybe a little bit easier, but there also was no internet. So you couldn't just scour job ads and you couldn't apply on a company's website. You had to go in person and fill out paper applications or hand in your
Mhm.
resume. And this was back when they were like, your resume should be on this high point cardstock paper and it should be very expensive looking. And like,
Yes, yes, exactly. And it could only be one page long, and there was this specific format that you had to use. And yes, it has to be on the South Fork letterhead, 35 pound, weight. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, yes, of course. And it was at that point, it was literal pounding the pavement, is what they used to call it. You just literally did go door to door with this stack of resumes and just put it in the boss's hand, and hope that you got called. So I mean, yeah, absolutely. The one bill that I have to absolutely make sure that I have paid is my phone. So I have internet, so I have, uh, I'll be able to work remotely. That's the only thing that I have to have on.
Yeah, and that also, I've heard people in the past be like, well, that homeless person has a smartphone. Why don't they, they could sell their smartphone. Oh, and what? You get your $22 for a used smartphone and now you don't have a phone anymore? That's
Right,
no,
exactly.
not
Right.
worth it at all.
Yeah, yeah.
But I mean, they talked to these women and they followed them through a bunch of different stuff. They showed how some of them are showering at like the YMCA or like
Mhm.
truck stops kind of thing where you can essentially rent a shower for or a
Yes,
bathroom for
yes.
an hour to have the time to do what you need to do. And they talked to these women about injuring themselves sleeping in a car or,
Mhm.
all of the damage that you do to your body living this way. But the one that I thought was the most interesting was none of these women had even applied for welfare. They didn't consider themselves at a point where they needed any kind of government assistance because they
Government
weren't
assistance.
they weren't there yet. And so the documentary people were talking to them about Section 8 housing, and one of the women, I think it was Louise,
Mm-hmm.
said, what is Section 8? Can you tell me what this is?" And so she hadn't even heard of it. None of these people had any idea that this was even an option. And so then as they're being introduced to it and filing, they're talking about the Section 8 system and about how difficult it is to get housing that way. It was just surreal to me that these women who were literally living in their cars with piles of their belongings, they had no place else to be, didn't
Right.
consider themselves to be at a point where they should be on benefits.
It was very hard for me to get there. Very, very hard. Because I was not raised to beg, and a good friend of mine actually had to sit me down and say, these systems are in place to help people like you who have a catastrophic emergency happen to them suddenly. Nobody plans to be homeless, obviously. Um, but when I first became homeless about 8 months ago, I had a caseworker, and this is great. Um, she said to me that I did not qualify for Section 8 housing or emergency housing assistance because I technically still had a job. And she was referring to my retail job because I just lost my university job. And I said, what? And she goes, as long as you have any income, you are not eligible for emergency housing. And I said, so wait, I'm not poor enough? So I'm supposed to quit the only job I have at all and not be able to buy food, and then the other problem is, again, this may just be in my state, but I sense it's for others. They give preference to families, the disabled, veterans, over 65, and or members of a protected class, and I am none of those. So I am very far down on, the list of anybody's priorities as far as our government is concerned. I received an email yesterday with, it's an application to apply to be in a lottery to get on a waiting list. That's
Oh my,
like four steps. I know. That's like four steps removed from getting any actual help. And, they were like, "Oh, well, we have 6,000 departments available." That that's not a lot in my state. That's
well, that's
that's
not a
that's
lot.
like,
I mean, we talked about it right in the opening that there were more than 500,000 homeless people in 2023. Like that was. the number that of recorded people that they were able to
Right.
tag and say, yes, you're homeless, and you throw them back into the wild like they do when they tag fish and stuff.
In
But
the wild, you tag them and throw them back in the wild. That's great. Yeah, I'll have to get my ear notched. I'm both homeless and spayed. There you go. Um, but no, I'm like, okay, wait. So I have to apply to be in a lottery to get an application to maybe be on a waiting list. you know, be dead by the time my name eventually circulates to the top. That's
oh my God, that's
ridiculous.
so incredibly dystopian. I
Yes, that's a perfect word for it, Rachel. It's dystopian.
Like when I
Yeah,
get furious when I get those emails that are like advertising emails and they're like, "Hey, you've been pre-selected to apply for this credit card." I'm like, "Oh, so you've selected me to apply. How frickin' special." But but
right,
I can't imagine if it was that approach to whether or not I get to live someplace. Like that's an awful
right.
approach. Oh,
Like you're pre-approved for this platinum card. I was like, really?
oh my goodness. But yes, that watching these women try to navigate the Section 8 housing system
Yeah,
and getting to listen to them go through and make phone call after phone call of, will you take Section 8 housing?
right.
Is this something you participate in? And they talked to one of the landlords who was like, look, it is
Ugh.
so much paperwork. It is incredibly difficult to set up and accept Section 8 housing. Most of us are not going to bother with that.
Right.
Which in fairness, like if it's adding a ton of work, I can see where people may not be interested in taking that. But at the same time, this is the system that we have in place. And if nobody's going to work with that system, then it doesn't address the homelessness.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And it's fundamentally broken. It really is. I mean, the system is just the logic is inherently flawed. And going back to that quotation that you just said, why actually repeat it word for word if you can about why we don't do anything to prevent it, the
Oh,
homelessness.
she opened the
Yeah,
documentary, like within that first couple of minutes of the documentary, she says, you see a lot about helping the homeless. Why
right.
can't the help come before you're homeless?
Yes. That's just it. We're trying to solve the wrong problem again. Yeah.
Well, and things are easier to fix if you address it before it becomes a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Putting in, the fire resistant things and smoke detectors and sprinklers ahead of time means you don't have to pay to replace your entire house when it burns down. It's the same
Exactly.
thing with every problem. If you address it before it becomes huge, if you put in place things that will prevent it from becoming a problem, it doesn't become a problem. And so watching as they're like, well, you're not poor enough. Here's this situation. You can't
Right,
do this.
exactly.
Well, if you don't make me become poor enough, then I won't. Maybe we can address this, and I won't have to live in a car. Like,
Right, exactly. Or a U-Haul or yeah. Well, and also I wanted to touch on something they said earlier in the documentary also about the homeless shelters and the temporary shelters actually being very, very dangerous for women. My caseworker 8 months ago, I said, okay, so I'm not poor enough. What do I do? Where do I go? Do I can I have a list of shelters or something? And she's like, well, yeah. She goes, I can give you a list of shelters, but they are in many cases more dangerous than the street. They are more dangerous than living in your car. You will be robbed. You may be sexually assaulted, even in the women's only shelters. And again, and I looked at the list of shelters, and the towns that they're in are, in my state at least, in the most dangerous towns, in where there is the most crime, the most gun violence, the biggest drug problems, the places that I'm frightened to even drive through, let alone pull over. I mean, where am I going to park my car that it won't be broken into? And she actually said you're safer in your car. than you are in these places. Many of the women staying there are very mentally ill, or they are coming off drugs. There's no medical help available at any of these places. Many of them don't even have food. It's just literally a place, she goes, don't even think about sleeping. Prop yourself up against a wall and keep your eyes open all night. I can't live like that. Who can live like that?
Nobody can live like that.
No.
And it is very upsetting to me to hear that a government official whose purpose is to help people in this situation to be like, look, the help in place isn't safe. You're better off being the
Exactly.
kind of homeless that people judge real hard when they walk by. Like
Yes.
that, mm. And to do nothing about it, like, oh,
Yeah.
oh my goodness. And I know that like they talk a lot in the documentary about how difficult this is for so many of these women, in large part because their spouses bounced and are not paying child support. They can't find them. They can't track down the child support. They're not getting the bills paid by their spouse to cover their children's living expenses. So they're all
Yeah.
homeless or borderline homeless. And
Hmm.
I ran the numbers, and Roxanne, you're going to lose your mind over this.
Oh,
so,
please. Why ruin a streak? Go for it.
so they talk in the documentary, and they say 308,000 cases of child support in LA County was the total number of child support cases they had in 1992. Of those
Hmm.
308,000 cases, about 27% of the parents in question made their payments. So, like
Hmm.
a quarter of, I'm assuming mostly fathers, but not only fathers, who owe child support were actually paying it. And they talked about how hard it was to track down the payments, and they talked to the LA County sheriffs, and they talked to lawyers who were helping track all of this down. And they threw out the numbers that 50% of divorced fathers don't pay their child support, and 66% of divorced fathers pay more for their car payments than they do in child support. And so they're going through all
Ah.
these numbers, and I was doing some research to try to figure out how accurate these numbers were, what do they compare to the numbers today, and I found an article in the LA Times from 1998
Hmm.
where they were addressing the extraordinary corruption in the DA's office of LA County, where he was negligent in his work, could have been collecting far more in child support and was just ignoring it. Like absolutely just letting these parents and their kids live on the streets and go hungry and die and get sick and all of the things that come along with that
Hmm.
because there was a lot of work, and rather than hiring somebody else or figuring out efficiency ways to do more, or trying to address it, he was just like, what are you gonna do, and just
Oh.
left it.
Oh.
So,
Ah.
so at least three of the women that were featured in this documentary could have had their problems addressed and may not have been homeless had the systems in place been run by people who were not corrupt assholes.
Right. Well, God, I think it was about 6 or 7 years ago. I was in my therapist's waiting room, and behind me, there were two men that had just met in the waiting room, and they were comparing hints and, well, they were trading hints about how to dodge child support payments.
Ah,
The two of them were comparing notes about how to get out of paying child support. And it took everything in me to keep from turning around and just lambasting them. But I knew that I couldn't. So there's this going on right out in front of everybody.
oh yeah, I
It
remember I was on the train once in New York City. I think it was the A train, and my then boyfriend, now husband at the time, and I were sitting, and a guy across the train from us was talking to his friend very loudly, talking about how he has 9 or 10 kids and he does not pay child support, and he's going on all this, and then got up, took off his hat, and went through the car to beg for change. And I was like, you know what? I'm thinking
I
there may be more to the reason you don't pay child support than what you were just telling your friend. Yeah, and
oh my God.
just absolute. nonsense. And while I do 100% understand if you are already in a financial position where you're not doing great and you can barely pay your bills, to then have to pay child support makes you feel like you are going to then be homeless. But you still had a child. That child still needs
Yes.
support. The fact that you
Yes.
don't want to pay that or don't feel like you can afford to pay that does not change the fact that this child now needs its bills paid. Like, it needs to be fed, it needs a place to live, it needs all the things that you need when you're a child.
Medical care, dental care, absolutely.
And
Clothing.
so while I understand that that urge to, well, I can't afford this. For so many of these men, like they showed in the documentary, they impounded some guys, what was it, a BMW or a Mercedes,
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
auctioned it off and then handed the money to the attorney so he could give it to the mom, and it was a portion of what she was owed. So it is very frustrating to see, especially the people who had money, who, what, you couldn't
Right.
drive a Honda and pay your child support, you had to have a Mercedes? Like, what is going
Right.
on?
Priorities, dude. Yeah.
And then they also said, one of the statistics that they used was after a divorce, a woman and her children will lose 73% of their standard of living. I
Mm.
I did go dig that up. Current numbers as of 2018 indicated that this was closer to 25 to 35% instead of 73%. And I was like, but that's a huge difference. Where are they getting that difference? And it's because that survey, and this is the survey that they are using in every modern, if you find an article about this, if you find any reference to this, these are the numbers, this 25 to 35% based on this 2018 survey. It was a
Uh-huh.
survey of 18,000 people in Germany. So they have socialized healthcare and decent public transportation and all of this stuff.
Sure.
And even with that social safety net, a divorce will leave a woman and her children still 25 to 35%, reduced standard of living in comparison. But in America, that 73% number feels about right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. Oh, that is just so depressing.
Yeah, but I mean,
It's
I
just
went and I was
so
looking it up,
depressing.
and like even Psychology Today and some big publications were referencing, these numbers, and they finally determined that women stand to lose probably about 50% of their pre-divorce income.
As a divorced woman, I agree. I agree with that. I certainly did. I mean, thank God after my husband abandoned me, I was fortunate enough to be able to move back in with my mom and dad. Who of course took me in because they're my mom and dad. But a lot of women who are abandoned don't have mom and dad or don't have mom and dad nearby. It's and many of them have children of their own. I don't have children, so thank God nobody else was dependent on me to for their well-being. I can't even take care of myself.
It's already so hard to take care of yourself in America today. Like the cost of maintaining just your day-to-day life and taking care of your needs, to then add a child, or and some of these people, like 4, 6 children some of
Sure.
these people had, that's so much. The expense of that is incredible. And if you're then going through this process and then you get a divorce and you are going to lose like 50% of your pre-divorce income,
Mm-hmm.
that leaves you just in an even worse situation. And this was so hard to watch because these poor women, like, we saw some of them bouncing from one friend's couch to another friend's couch, like going from place to place, needing places to land, and doing
Yeah.
this, hauling kids with them everywhere they were going, just
Well,
too
not I mean,
much.
not to mention now you have to deal the poor kids now suddenly don't have dad in the picture. So these women now have to be both mom and dad emotionally, which they were not prepared for. Because again, nobody gets married thinking that they're going to be divorced, eventually. Well, unless you have like a prenup or something like that. But it's so there's that extra that added weight, as well, and the bouncing from couch to couch. I tried that as well, and eventually was evicted from many of my friends' places. They were like, listen, you have worn out your welcome. You were supposed to be here for 2 weeks. It's now been 3 months, and we love you, Roxanne, but we can't support you. We cannot house you long term. And boy, now, how's that for another kick in the ego? It's like, well, fine, then I just pick up my stuff and get on the road again, I guess.
Yeah, and it is very hard to be on both ends of that equation. And we had a family friend and her daughter who were, after a bad divorce, had no place to live. They were sharing a queen size bed in somebody's house and paying out the wazoo to be able to have that benefit. And so I said, you know what? Our house is split. We have the entire downstairs. We'll make sure my daughter's stuff all comes upstairs. We'll give you that downstairs. It'll be like an apartment. I'll have to get down there to access the laundry. You'll have to come up to access the kitchen, but we'll make this work. And
Mhm.
so for $750 a month, she had half a house essentially.
Right.
And then when I got a better job, I had a significant increase in income. I went to her and I said, I tell you what, let's lower your rent. Let's lower your rent to $500 a month that you're good. And she said, okay, that's fine. And then COVID hit and we had all of this stuff and we were very clearly on opposite ends of COVID precautions. Where, I mean, my family still, I mean, it's 2025, we still mask when we go out because we're so very
Sure,
cautious. I have
sure.
autoimmune issues, my husband's diabetic. We're very cautious about it. And she was from the beginning, like within 6 months, not masking at work and going through all this stuff. She didn't feel like it was necessary. And I get it because for her, this was just another responsibility thrown on this pile of responsibilities she was already
Hmm.
dealing with her daughter and fighting her ex and dealing with all this stuff. But so I sat down and I said to her, you have 8 months, this next 8 months, I'm not going to charge you any rent. It's completely free, but you have to leave at the end of that 8 months because this is no
Right,
longer working for us.
right.
And at the end of that 8 months, I came to her and I was like, okay, where are you going? And she was like, oh, I just wanted to start paying you rent again and stay here. And so it turned into this whole, now I have to evict you, and it turns into this fight, and
Oh,
now we're not friends anymore. And on the one hand, I am furious that I went out of my way to make this as easy as possible for her to let her build up some savings and deal with all of this. But at the other end, she is a single person making 25 bucks an hour, having to pay for everything for her kid. There is no affordable housing anywhere near where she works. So she was looking at adding a commute. I can understand where in that moment she was like, if we could just work the rest of this out, we could stay here. This works for us.
right.
She didn't want to leave that space. But from my end, I didn't feel safe in my own home. And
Oh,
so
yeah.
ours was a very large version, but even like they a couple of the women at one point, Rena and I think it was Rena, was staying with a family friend and they were like, you can be here as long as you want. I've known you for 20 years. We love you. You can be here. 2 weeks later, she had to go because they had a family member
Exactly.
who needed to come in and have that space. So,
Hmm.
like, even on the smaller end, how did that impact her relationship with these people? Is she now still friends with them? Does she feel put out and like hated and has it caused a fight between them?
It's awkward. It's very, very awkward. Many times I'll call a friend just because I want to talk to my friend, and like I can tell by the way they go, hello, there's that. Is she going to ask to borrow money? Is she going to ask to get a ride somewhere? Is she going to ask if she can stay on my sofa or in my guest room? And I can tell they're already plotting how to say no. And I don't want to be that friend because 9 times out of 10, I just want to know how they're doing. I don't want to have them look down and see my name come up on their phone and have them go, oh, okay. I don't want to answer the phone. I hate that I'm that person. How did I get to be that person? How did that happen?
Well,
You know?
and also, what are your other options? You're
Exactly.
if we're supposed to lean on community when we can't take care of ourselves, you have to be able to lean on your community, especially when the government options aren't available to you the way that you've
Hmm.
faced, where you tried to go through the system and they told you no.
Right. And
You,
then they said you're not homeless enough, you're not poor enough, and also it's dangerous. The help we're offering you is dangerous. So, okay.
yeah, so how else are you supposed to handle stuff? You cannot, people are not an island. You cannot be on your own and take care of all of your stuff. Like, you have to have other people in your life that you can lean on and that they can lean on you. And if you're in a situation where everybody now doesn't want to interact with you because they're afraid you might need that help,
I
that
might
just
want something.
that just makes life that much harder.
Well, it's even stupid little things like not having a legal address. That is the biggest pain in the ass. Because you're not, in my state at least, you're not allowed to list a hotel as your permanent address, because then that makes the hotel a landlord, and then they have to follow a whole bunch of other laws. I mean, even at the hotel I'm at now, I have to check out every 28 days, because if I stay 28 days or longer in a row, that makes them a landlord. Um, so I can't list this as an address. So I am still using a friend's address. Thank God he's letting me to use that. But that's where I'm getting mail delivered, but I don't have a car to get my mail. So at his convenience, he has to bring my mail to my store where I work or to the hotel. So now he's going out of his way. He's in another town, and he's got a job and a life and a family, but now he's accumulating my mail, a lot of which is legal related stuff from my attorneys and the various court systems that I'm fighting. And it's time sensitive stuff. And now he has to go out of his way to get in his truck and drive to another town, find me wherever I am, give me my mail, and try to explain to people over the phone, well, no, I don't really live there. That's just where I get my mail, and blah, blah, blah. Well, why don't you live there? It's exhausting. It's absolutely exhausting. To this day, I have no idea where some of my mail might be going. I really don't.
Well, and that this is a problem for 650,000 people that are on
Yeah.
record, probably significantly more than that. According to a
Mm-hmm.
YouGov survey, they found that in 2022 and 2023, 20% of the people that were surveyed had been homeless at some point or another during one of those years.
Mm-hmm.
So now, granted, the CEO of Aetna is not taking a YouGov survey. That's not how he's spending his time. But like,
Exactly.
of the people that are taking these surveys, 20% of them, one in five, has had a point where they were homeless at some point. And when I stopped and I thought about it, I realized technically I have been homeless because
Mm.
we had lived in New York City for a while, and one day there was a knock on the door, and I had a 3-month-old baby, like I brand new mom, and my
Oh, that's
husband,
when we first met. That's when we first got to be friends. That's right.
yeah.
Okay. Hmm.
Um, I answered the door, and it was a police officer and somebody from the Red Cross, and they said, "Your building is being condemned. You have 12 hours to get out." And I had to call my husband at work and be like, "You have to come home right now,
Right
and
now.
we have to sort out where we're going to live." And we went and stayed with his mom for a couple of weeks, and then that didn't work.
Right.
She was in a relatively small apartment, so we went to stay with his aunt for like a month and a half while we sorted out. We had looked at maybe trying to buy a house, but then we were like, you know what, let's just be in an apartment again for a year or two while we figure some stuff out.
Hmm.
And when I look back on this period where I was legally homeless, technically,
Right.
couch surfing, I was staying in a $1 million beach house that was
Hmm.
owned by his aunt. I woke up overlooking, gorgeous ocean views, and like
Oh
it
my.
did not feel like, if you had asked me at that point, are you homeless? I would have been like, no. It never would have occurred to
Right.
me that was what I was, but technically by the book that
Technically speaking, sure.
technically I was homeless. And it was lovely to have people who were there and able to catch us so that we did not end up really like living on the street homeless, especially with a newborn
Right.
baby and two cats and a dog.
Oh,
And all of
oh,
that.
that's right.
Um, but we were so lucky to have people who were able to keep us housed while we figured it out. Because it took
Mm-hmm.
about 2 months from the knock on the door to when we were in another place where we had another place to live.
Sure, sure.
And it was so hard. It was sharing space with people when this is not your chosen family, this is not who you're wanting to live in a
Mm,
house with, is so
right.
hard. You have different routines, different standards, different ways you clean and different ways you handle things, and you butt up against each other all the time. And
Mm-hmm.
it was very uncomfortable. And part of the reason that we did not wait it out to buy a place was because we just couldn't keep living under other people's rules for however long it was going to take to close on a
It's
house.
exhausting. It's really exhausting because you always do have, no matter how many times they tell you, your family, you never really do feel like family. You still feel like a guest, and you still have that mentality that you're a guest. And it's living with other people is very difficult, especially if these are people that you want to keep in your life after you move out. You know,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it was just a lot, but it's never anything that I would have thought of myself as homeless. None of the government numbers would have reflected me as homeless at that time because I never would
Right.
have shown up on anybody's radar.
Sure.
I
Or a census or anything. Of course not.
So when we're looking at there are 650 some odd thousand homeless people in 2023, that number is probably significantly higher. And
Oh,
at
of
the
course.
on the documentary, they said, according to the Homeless Advocacy Coalition, there are 3 million homeless in the United States in 1992. They estimate 6.5 million homeless people by the year 2000.
Mm-hmm.
I was not able to find a group under that name. My guess is that name had changed sometime between 1992 and today, and I can't sort out
Mm-hmm.
exactly what organization had ran these numbers. And
Mm-hmm.
it does not, like, by the numbers, 650,000 homeless people is nowhere near 6.5 million. That's 10 times
Mm.
less. But
Sure.
how many people are now doing exactly what I did when my building got condemned and what you did, what you're doing now that you've kind
Mm-hmm.
of run through this and are living in hotels? There are
Right.
probably millions of people dealing with exactly those situations.
Mm-hmm. Right. Exactly. And I'm sure that most people were like me and they thought, well, this is just going to be for a couple weeks and then I'll find something permanent. Well, then cold weather sets in and and just then you lose the car and this, that, and the other thing. And it's like one ghastly plot twist after another, and it's
Yeah.
I it's hard it's hard to maintain a good attitude, a positive attitude. I mean, thank God that I do still have my job at the store and my friends, and my weird sense of humor, which is like a bit macabre sometimes, but it's my coping mechanism, damn it. And this is why I watch horror movies, all all on Netflix in the hotel. Why not? My life can't get any more Byzantine at
Well,
this point.
and when you look at the numbers, according to the National Coalition for the Homeless,
Yeah.
in 2023, 53% of homeless people living in shelters are employed. They're working,
Yes.
at least part-time,
Yes.
some of them full-time. And when we talk about minimum wage needs to be higher, we need to have more standards. This is why, because you shouldn't be homeless if you have a job. Like, you shouldn't be
Right.
homeless at all. But if you
You
are
should
working,
all exactly.
but
Sure.
if you are working, you should absolutely be able to
Hmm.
pay your bills at least enough to be able to afford shelter. Like
Right.
if you cannot afford to put a roof over your head, what is the point of working? What is the point
Hmm.
of participating in our society if you cannot function within it?
Right. Exactly. And because we say, well, why don't you be a productive member of society? We are very productive members of society, and just give us that little inch where we can be even more productive, and help other people. I mean, and I understand, like, my caseworker, she's got this crappy civil service job. I'm sure that she sees people much more destitute than I am, much more desperate, and in much more need. Absolutely. But I mean, how does this not crush her soul? Having to actually say, we do have these things in place, but it might kill you. Don't wear your mother's wedding ring into one of these shelters because they'll break your finger off in order to get to it. I don't know. We need to find a way to just we need better government programs, obviously. We need better criteria in order to get that help, obviously. We need to find a way to make the help safe, but because not a lot of people want to go into this field because it is depressing. It's a horribly, horribly depressing field. Most people who go into social work go into a different field of mental health by the time that they're 35. They come out of college and they're very enthusiastic. I'm going to help this. I'm going to clean up the system. I'm going to be, the advocate for the poor and the downtrodden, and I'm going to make $40,000 a year and share an office with 9 other people and work 18 hours, and then the reality hits and that enthusiasm wanes. And they see the revolving door of people like me, just coming, in and out, and eventually they get burned out, understandably, absolutely understandably. I can't imagine my caseworker having to have the conversation she had with me all day every day for years, telling other women, we can't help you, you're not poor enough, or sorry, you're not disabled, you're not a veteran, you're not a person of color, you're not a priority.
Or worse, depending on which state you're in, sometimes if you're not working, they can't help you. They're set up to only help people who are working.
Yep.
So the criteria is just very hit and miss.
It
I'm
is.
thinking of the book and the subsequent Netflix show Made, where she talks about she wasn't working and she left her abusive husband, and she went in to get help from, the government. She went into a government office and they're like, we can't help you if you don't have a job. We can't place you anywhere. Here's the number for a maid service. You go in and they'll hire you today. And if you keep the job, then we can go in and we can try. But this was their, we can't help you until you're working. But you're facing the exact opposite. Because you are working,
Exactly.
we cannot help you. And I feel like the thing that we seem to be missing is there needs to be a layer of help that comes before this. Like, not,
Hmm.
okay, I'm homeless, so now I need to go into this office and figure out what's going on, but hey, life is getting a little hard. I need to
Right.
talk to somebody about what this means, or hey, my husband and I are in therapy. I think our relationship is going to end in the next 6 months. Now
Hmm.
let's talk about what it takes to keep me from becoming homeless. Or
Exactly. Exactly.
yeah,
Sure.
there should
Exactly.
be an office somewhere that where you can go in and be like, okay, so this is my situation. This is why it's hard. What
Hmm.
resources do you have for me? And we should have resources for people in those situations.
Hmm. Yeah, you could, the office could be called something like, I did the math. And that's when you go in there and you're like, okay, I did the math and I'm going to be homeless in 6 months. Or I did the math and in 4 months I'm not going to be able to afford my rent and food. Or I did the math and I'm going to have to. I work with a woman at the store who she had to quit her job at the store because she couldn't afford to keep her car. She had to sell her car Therefore, she could no longer come to the store. So she was somehow less poor without a job. Then I mean it boggled my mind. And she was like, I can't. She goes, insurance, gas. She said, she goes, just having the car sit in the driveway, the insurance alone was eating up the salary she made at the store. And she loved the job at the store. And like I said, it's a great job. We all love working there. And it was heartbreaking. And this woman was in her early 60s.
Oh,
Her husband had died. The the life insurance money had run out. Her adult children live on the other side of the country and have their own lives. And so now she had to sell the car, and I don't know what she's doing as to how she gets around to get food or anything like that. So I have no idea. And I was like, "Oh my God. When I'm in my early 60s, am I still not going to be safe? When am I going to be safe? When am I going to be safe?" That's all I could think about. When I'm 70, when I'm 80, am I even going to live that long considering how I have to eat now? It's oh my God.
yeah, and I'm remembering the Barbara Ehrenreich book Nickel and Dimed. I don't know if you ever read
I
that.
do not know that. I do not know of that.
It is fantastic. You should absolutely read it if you have
I'm
the
writing this
opportunity.
down. What's it called?
It's called Nickel and Dimed, and the
Nickel
sub
and dimed.
and the subtitle is On Not Getting By in America. And
Ah, okay.
Barbara Ehrenreich is, or was, she died a couple of years ago, was a investigative reporter who did a lot of research into topics like the ones we're talking about now.
Mm-hmm.
And she
Mm-hmm.
did a project to see could she survive on um like essentially working retail jobs, part-time retail, maid work, like could she
Mm-hmm.
drop into a city with no real resume and like take care of herself
Right.
if she was not in a white collar job? And she determined really no, you can't. But
Yeah.
the book is her going through this whole process, and she talks a lot about um the things that she faces in there and her coworkers and the things that they face in there. And at one point she is a waitress at a diner in like Key West. And one of her coworkers is so excited because the manager of the restaurant has said she can park in the restaurant parking lot overnight and sleep there. And that is the benefit she's getting from this job. She'll never leave
Yeah.
this job because she has a place to park her car and be homeless.
Car and sleep. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, she gets into details in a lot of different ways. At one point, she's a maid in a rural area of Maine, and at one
Mm-hmm.
point, she's a waitress in Key West, Florida. And like she's bouncing around trying, could you live if you just landed here and had nothing? Like
Mm-hmm.
how would that work?
Mm-hmm.
And she points out at one point, I am healthy and white and able-bodied, and I showed up with a car and I couldn't do it. So how are
Uh-huh.
these people
Yeah.
supposed to do this? Um,
Right.
but I was especially taken by the stories she told about her coworkers and the situations that they dealt with and the things that in her mind it never would have occurred to her that anybody had to deal with any of that. It's a
Sure.
wonderful book. I highly recommend it.
I wrote it down. I'm definitely gonna check that out. I mean, I mean it's weird because you sit here and I'm think of stuff like, well, if I was in my 20s, I could have at least maybe joined the military. That would have given me a place to live. Federal crime? Could I commit a federal crime? I could go, it's ridiculous that I'm only 80% joking. You know, you know,
Well, and the
it's
problem with committing a federal crime, okay, then yes, you have a bed and yes, you have people that are feeding you, but you have no privacy and you are now
no.
essentially slave labor. Our
Yeah,
entire prison
exactly.
system is
And
set up
I'm
that
cute. I would not work well in prison. Or with my luck, I'd get a good lawyer and I'd get off.
Yeah,
Um,
it's to be faced with a situation where you have to think, would it be better for me to be in the system in that way? Because
yes,
temporarily, at least I would have housing and food and all of that. But then you come out the other end of it. And now you can't work because you're a felon. And now you can't so you have to stay in that situation
right.
forever. And it's a
Forever, right?
shitty, horrible situation where you are legit slave labor, where they are farming you
Exactly.
out for pennies on the dollar to fight fires or take phone calls or run.
There you go.
Like
Right.
it's
Exactly. And I
it's
just have
not good.
bad tattoos and all sorts. Yeah, it wouldn't go well.
Yeah,
It wouldn't work
if
out.
it would
No.
be a poor choice, but that there
Yes.
are people who have to think that way and make that choice
Hmm.
is astonishing, and it is a good example of just how broken our country actually is.
Exactly. Yeah. Boy, this has been a feel good podcast.
Yes.
Why did I agree to do this?
But, well, these are important conversations, and
That's right.
acknowledging that we're missing a layer in the help that we offer to people, I think is an important point. And I think there's a lot of people who maybe haven't thought of it that way, and they don't realize how difficult it is, even with government assistance, to climb up out of this situation and make your life better, because then you're stuck. If you try to get incrementally better, then they cut your benefits.
Yeah.
And you're stuck in this loop where if your life is going to get better, it has to get a lot better right away. You can't
Yeah.
slowly build over time.
Yes, exactly, exactly. Getting a $3 an hour raise at work isn't going to help me. I would need like a $50,000 a year raise. That's in order to make that leap, into back into survival mode. It's easy to fall down the hole. It's not easy to get out,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
But thanks for listening to Real Stories, Real Problems with your hosts, Rachel and Roxanne. We hope you enjoyed our deep dive into the problem of hidden homelessness and the documentary It Was a Wonderful Life. Join us again next week for a glimpse into another financial problem and a documentary all about it. If you enjoyed our show today, please remember to like, subscribe, and leave us a review on your podcast app. Thanks for listening and see you again next week.
Bye.